But we start tonight with the founding of the Family Research Council. The Family Research Council was founded as a very conservative, hardline, religious right activist group in the early 1980s. James Dobson has always been the figurehead and the prime mover of the Family Research Council. But its initial funding came in large part from a Michigan businessman, a man named Edgar Prince. Edgar Prince ran a manufacturing company that made auto parts and other stuff through the 60s, 70s, 80s, into the 90s. But what Edgar Prince became famous for was not just his business acumen in Michigan. It was what he did with his fortune. He put his family fortune into super right-wing social conservative advocacy. So anti-gay activism, anti-abortion activism, anti-pornography activism, really hard-right social conservative stuff. The Prince family was one of the richest families in the whole state of Michigan, and they made a big right-wing political impact with that family fortune. That became all the more true when one of Edgar Prince's children, his daughter Betsy, married into one of the other richest families in the state of Michigan. She married into the family that controlled the Amway empire. And now Betsy DeVos represents the unification of the Prince family fortune and the DeVos family fortune, and all of the crusading activism that conservative multi-billionaire families can muster. Betsy DeVos is now our nation's Secretary of Education in the Trump administration. But her little brother represents a different marriage of fortunes. Betsy DeVos's younger brother is Eric Prince. Eric Prince represents the marriage of the Prince family fortune, which he was also born into, and the kind of fortune that can be made when you privatize war, when you contract out the work of the Army or the Special Forces to instead be done by a for-profit enterprise. In the case of Blackwater, that for-profit enterprise just happened to be run by a mega-rich, super hardline, crusading religious right activist who was born a billionaire before he ever got his first no-bid contract during the Iraq War. Ever since Blackwater contractors were convicted of killing 17 unarmed Iraqi civilians, and the name Blackwater disappeared, and the company reinvented itself multiple times with increasingly hard-to-Google generic and obscure names. And ever since Eric Prince himself left the country and moved his family to Abu Dhabi, where he feels, I don't know, safer, freer? Eric Prince's mainstream public profile has dropped in recent years as the controversies of George W. Bush's Iraq War have started to fade into history. But Eric Prince did not fade entirely from view everywhere. Just a few days before the November election, Breitbart News, the conservative website run by then Trump campaign CEO, now presidential advisor Steve Bannon, a couple days before the election, Breitbart published a scoop citing, quote, well-placed sources in the NYPD. Eric Prince told Breitbart right before the election that Hillary Clinton was about to be arrested. Police were about to make arrests in a money laundering / child sex ring that Hillary Clinton apparently busied herself with when she wasn't running for president or being Secretary of State. According to Eric Prince and his sources in law enforcement, the Obama Justice Department was avidly trying to cover up this scandal, but according to him, he knew from insiders arrests were imminent. Trump supporters wouldn't have to wait for their candidate to get elected before Hillary got locked up. Hillary was going to get locked up even before the election by the NYPD or the FBI or Academy or She or Blackwater or Eric Prince himself. I don't know. Eric Prince also reported that Hillary Clinton was frequently known to go to a secret sex island with pedophiles. Eric Prince also reported that Huma Abedin was a top advisor to Hillary Clinton. She was an agent of influence for the Muslim Brotherhood. Eric Prince told Breitbart that Hillary Clinton's private email server was not just an email scandal, it was a murder scandal. Hillary Clinton had murdered people with her emails. See, that's why the emails had to be in a private server, because that's how she did the murdering. So Eric Prince faded from sort of mainstream public view, but he remains a big deal in Trumpland, especially in the Steve Bannon Breitbart News part of Trumpland. He's also Education Secretary Betsy DeVos's brother. He's also reported to have given $100,000 to a super PAC supporting the Trump campaign right before the election. And now Bloomberg News reports that Erik Prince also played a significant personal role in the Trump transition. In fact, what Bloomberg News reports is that both before and after the election, Erik Prince met multiple times with Trump staffers, including with Michael Flynn, who would go on to be National Security Advisor to the new president before he was fired. Erik Prince was reportedly tasked by the Trump folks with approaching people in the private sector about them possibly taking government jobs. He reportedly took multiple trips to Trump transition offices, both in Washington and in Trump Tower and elsewhere. Apparently, according to Bloomberg News, he used a backdoor entrance to Trump Tower to avoid the reporters in the lobby so he wouldn't be seen going in and out. Bloomberg reporters also apparently spoke with somebody who was within earshot of a meeting that happened between Erik Prince and Kellyanne Conway and another Trump transition figure on a moving train on the Acela between New York and Washington, D.C. The eavesdropper told Bloomberg News that the three of those people were discussing reorganizing the United States intelligence community. This new reporting from Bloomberg about Erik Prince having a substantive role in the transition, and apparently with the Trump campaign as well before the election. This new reporting is important now, both because Erik Prince is an interesting figure, but also because the Trump administration has been denying up and down for more than a week now that Erik Prince had anything to do with them. That Erik Prince had anything to do with the campaign or the transition or anyone in the administration. I mean, they can't deny that he's Betsy's little brother, but they have denied that Erik Prince had any other connection to anything else about the Trump administration or the Trump campaign or the process of setting up either of those things. The reason those denials about Erik Prince have been so urgent is because 2 weeks ago, the Washington Post reported that 9 days before the inauguration, January 11th, Washington Post reports that Erik Prince traveled to the Seychelles Islands, which are very far away in the Indian Ocean. He traveled to the Seychelles Islands to take 2 days of meetings with a Russian emissary from Vladimir Putin's office. The Russian official who Erik Prince supposedly met with has not been named, but the Post reports that Erik Prince, quote, presented himself as an unofficial envoy for Trump when the meeting was being set up, and the Russian envoy was understood to be a representative of Vladimir Putin. According to the Post, quote, U.S. officials say the FBI has been scrutinizing that meeting in the Seychelles as part of a broader probe of Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. election and alleged contacts between associates of Putin and Trump. Now, again, this is a reported meeting between Erik Prince and an envoy for Vladimir Putin. A meeting in this incredibly remote location. You see it's off the eastern coast of Africa there, off Tanzania and Kenya. This meeting, these 2 days of meetings, took place at an incredibly intense time, right? This is 9 days before the inauguration. A week before that meeting is when U.S. intelligence community put out its report saying that Russia had interfered in the election to help Donald Trump win. And then a week after that report comes out, a guy advising the Trump transition goes and meets with Putin's buddy for 2 days of secret island meetings? What? Why? Michael Flynn was the first national security advisor for this new administration. He initially did not disclose and then ultimately lied about his contacts with the Russian government. Those lies and the nature of those contacts, though, were ultimately reported out. They became publicly known through journalism, and Michael Flynn was fired. Attorney General Jeff Sessions also did not disclose his contacts with Russian officials, but they were ultimately reported out. Then he had to admit to them. Then he had to come up with some explanation for why he'd never disclosed them in the past. Ultimately, he had to recuse himself from any investigations involving the Trump campaign in Russia. Then it was Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law and senior advisor. Jared also did not disclose multiple contacts with different Russian officials during the transition, including his meeting with the head of a bank that's linked to Russian intelligence, who himself had been handpicked for that banking job by Vladimir Putin. Kushner initially did not disclose his meetings with Russian officials either. Nevertheless, they were reported out. Ultimately, he never explained them. Ultimately, he never had to recuse himself from anything, nor did he get fired from anything. But as of today, one Democratic congressman in Virginia is suggesting that Jared Kushner not disclosing those meetings with Russian officials should at least cost him his security clearance, if not get him prosecuted. And now we have another one. Right? Now we've got this new one, another previously undisclosed meeting between someone associated with the Trump transition and a Russian official. And in this case, it was held secretly, initially denied, subsequently reported out. And in this case, the initial denial was that guy had nothing to do with the transition. It's now reported that he did have quite a lot to do with the transition. And the meeting itself, why these contacts with the Russians, still not explained. And that list even sets aside the whole Carter Page sideshow, right? This Trump campaign foreign policy advisor, who we now know was the subject of a FISA court warrant to monitor his communications because of the FBI's view that he was not just in contact with the Russian government, he was a knowing agent of the Russian government, as he held multiple meetings, not just with Russian officials in the United States, but also with Russian officials in Moscow during the campaign while the Russian government was interfering in the election to help Donald Trump. So, I mean, if you were just stacking up previously undisclosed meetings between Trump campaign figures and Russians, is this it now? I mean, how many more new disclosures are there going to be? You guys know by now that if you had meetings with Russians, you should tell people, right? It's going to get reported. You should. Anybody else? The Erik Prince meeting in the Seychelles Islands with the envoy from Putin's office. This is just the latest in what is now a very long series of previously denied secret Russian meetings by Trump-linked people, to the point where it's almost comedic. Are there more? Is this the full list? And even if there aren't any more, and this is the full list, can we get an explanation for what all these meetings were about? Are we ever going to get any sort of unified field explanation from the administration or anyone else as to why there were so many contacts between people associated with Donald Trump and Russian officials during the campaign and during the transition? And during the administration, too? Don't know. This is the Kara Sea, K-A-R-A. See up there in the upper right-hand corner, the Kara Sea? It's a very far north place on Earth. We think of places like Sweden and Finland being very far north. Further north from there, parts of Siberia in Russia. Further north from Siberia is the Kara Sea. Kara Sea is home to the northernmost oil discovery in the world. In 2014, the Russian government-owned oil company, Rosneft, they drilled a well up in the Kara Sea, or at least they decided a well should be drilled there. It was actually Exxon who provided the rig. That was the product of a joint partnership. In 2012, Exxon's CEO hammered out this deal with Rosneft. Basically, it was the mother of all oil deals. It put Exxon and Rosneft into a joint partnership deal to drill the Kara Sea, to drill elsewhere in the Arctic, to drill the Black Sea, to drill Siberia. That deal that Exxon CEO Rex Tillerson hammered out with Russia in 2012 is thought to be the biggest oil deal ever. Vladimir Putin said at the time it was likely to be a $500 billion deal, a $500 billion deal. They did that deal in 2012. Following year, 2013, Putin bestowed upon Rex Tillerson the Order of Friendship, Russia's highest award that they give to a non-Russian citizen. The year after that, 2014, victory in the Kara Sea, literally victory. Victory is the name they gave to the well that they drilled in the Kara Sea. That was fitting because they really hit pay dirt with that first well. That first well, they said, was capable of producing 750 million barrels of oil, just that one well. Overall in the Kara Sea, based on their initial exploratory work, they said they think the Kara Sea holds nearly 90 billion barrels of oil, which is way bigger than even Saudi Arabia's biggest oil fields. But that initial well in the Kara Sea in 2014, that was both their greatest victory and the end of it all. Because right after they drilled that well and hit oil, right? They thought they could get 750 million barrels of oil just out of that one well. Right after they drilled it, right after they made that announcement, boom, sanctions from the U.S. government on Russia, including on Rosneft specifically, and individually on the guy who runs Rosneft. Sanctions as punishment for Russia invading Ukraine and taking Crimea. Can't do business with those folks in Russia anymore. And that stopped that giant $500 billion Exxon oil deal in its tracks. Nobody has drilled in the Kara Sea since then. Although you can see the Russians are getting antsy about it. In February, the Russian state-owned gas company, Gazprom, they issued a tender looking for tugboats and a passenger vessel to try to put another rig out there to at least drill for gas, even if Exxon can't come back out there and drill for more oil. Well, Exxon wants to get out there and drill for more oil. Today in the Wall Street Journal, we learned that Exxon is applying to be exempted from the U.S. sanctions on Russia, specifically so they can restart that oil drilling with Rosneft. Only now it's not Rex Tillerson, Exxon's CEO, who's doing the asking. Now it's Rex Tillerson's successor at Exxon doing the asking. And the person he's asking is Rex Tillerson, because Rex Tillerson is now the U.S. Secretary of State. Tillerson will personally have to recuse himself from direct say over this decision because of his continuing financial ties to Exxon. But it's an eye-popping development, right? I mean, not least because of the mega amount of money that's involved here, but also because of the unexplained coincidences and eventualities here. I mean, it's still not totally clear how Rex Tillerson ended up being Secretary of State, particularly since he and Donald Trump had never met before the November election. All the other people whose names were floated for Secretary of State made much more sense from Trump's perspective, right? I mean, former political rivals who he might want to bring into his camp, like Mitt Romney. People he'd seen on TV, like John Bolton. Old friends, like Rudy Giuliani. Or Rex Tillerson, who Donald Trump had never met, had never had anything to do with before, had never laid eyes on before the election. How did Rex Tillerson get that job? He must have come very highly recommended by someone. But if Rosneft and Exxon could please start drilling again, if Rosneft and Exxon could please just get an exemption from those U.S. government sanctions, obviously that would be great for Exxon, but it would be particularly great for Rosneft, which, as I mentioned, is owned by the government of Russia. As I mentioned right at the top of the show, Elizabeth Warren is here tonight for the interview. She's got a new book out. It's called This Fight is Our Fight. Elizabeth Warren is obviously one of the highest profile influential Democrats in the country, certainly one of the most famously pugnacious Democrats in the country. It has been an interesting question in our domestic politics as to who will lead on the Democratic side now, who will have the best instincts, who will have the best message, who will have the best skills, who will have the smartest strategy to lead the Democratic Party as it transitions from being the Democratic Party of the Obama era to being the Democratic Party of the Trump era. Elizabeth Warren's new book is about the war on the middle class, how much harder it has become to be middle class in this country, the kinds of policies that would help recreate and save the middle class. But it is also about why those policies don't exist, and it's about what Democrats are up against right now in terms of this new administration specifically. Here's how she describes Trump and him setting up his new cabinet. Quote, a Treasury secretary from Wall Street who raked in a fortune helping Goldman Sachs build the weapons to blow up the economy and then pocketed another fortune foreclosing on homeowners who bore the brunt of the crash. A commerce secretary from Wall Street whose legendary history of squeezing his companies for every dollar caught up to him when a dozen coal miners were killed in an explosion at one of his chronically unsafe mines. A secretary of education, Betsy DeVos, who contributed millions to privatize public education and who crudely explained that when she and her family contributed money, quote, we expect a return on our investment. And a Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, from the sovereign state of big oil, who improved his corporation's profits and pumped up his own bonuses by cozying up to Vladimir Putin. Trump and his team collectively control billions of dollars of wealth. Now that they're running the government, they have the potential, either while in office or once they pass through the revolving door, to turn their billions into tens of billions, hundreds of billions, or even more. As for Trump himself, why should he wait to cash in? He's already said that the president can't have a conflict of interest, so he sees no need to make a distinction between the work he does as a public servant and the work he does to put more money in his pocket. So, for example, after he was elected, he again refused to release his taxes. That means the American people will never find out the truth about his financial interests and never know whether he's in deep hock in Russia or making big bucks in the Middle East, things that could profoundly influence the decisions he will make as president. She continues, quote, the levers of government, the ability to enforce laws, to make rules, to award contracts, to rattle cages, to invade countries, to help friends. All those levers are now in the hands of a man who has spent his entire life making the government work for exactly one person, himself. The influence of money on the government, on our government, the one we own, is about to be tested to the breaking point. The influence of money on the government. And other stuff, too. If you are a progressive Democrat, if you're a high-profile Democrat trying to lead the country in a different direction than this president, trying to oppose this president and his party, how do you balance these two different things that we are contending with now as a country? Right? I mean, on the one hand, there are the Betsy DeVosses of the world, right? You know, using generational family wealth and hardline right-wing activism and epic political donations to grab yourself a cabinet position, to invent yourself some qualifications for high public office. You know, there's the Goldman Sachsization of the government. There's the self-dealing and the personal enrichment opportunities that government provides for the already very rich. Right? That's all part of the progressive diagnosis in terms of what's wrong with Republican governance. But then there is something else here that is very different. There is also this existential scandal about whether this administration didn't just benefit from a foreign intelligence operation. There's the question of whether it's part of one. If you are a Democrat opposed to the Trump administration, if you see it as your life's work to try to bring the country along in a progressive direction, which of those levels of scandal is the Titanic and which is the deck chairs, right? How do you make sense strategically, politically, patriotically, every single day about what to focus on and where to fight? Let's ask Elizabeth Warren. She joins us next. Joining us now for the interview, I'm very happy to say, is Senator Elizabeth Warren, Democrat of Massachusetts. She's got a new book out. It's called This Fight Is Our Fight, The Battle to Save America's Middle Class. Senator Warren, thank you so much for being here.
I'm delighted to be here with you.
This is your 11th book.
It is.
A bunch of your other books were your electoral politics life. You wrote about bankruptcy, you wrote about the middle class, you wrote about debt, you wrote about dual income families. It's part of, you could see in your earlier writing the way you made the transition from academic to advocate to, well, academic to policy wonk to advocate and now to an elected official.
That's right.
Why keep writing books now that you are an elected official?
Because it's still one way I make the argument. It's still one of the tools in the toolbox to be able to get out there and fight. Because the point, of course, about all this is really the books are identifying the same kind of problem that's going on. And that's basically, I tell the long arc story in this book, how it starts first with what America did right, how we built a great middle class coming out of the Great Depression, 1935. And part of it was about regulating industries that were too big, giving small businesses a chance, enforcing antitrust laws, breaking up the banks so that there was Glass-Steagall. We separated, you know, boring banking from high-flying banking. And at the same time, progressive taxation and taking that money and putting it into opportunity. Opportunity for the middle class, for working families, for the poor to have a chance to grow into something. We invested in education, we invested in infrastructure, in roads and bridges and power in rural areas. We invested in research, in a pipeline of ideas. 1935 to 1980, we made those investments, and you know what? It worked. It worked. We built the strongest, greatest middle class the earth had ever seen. The country kept getting richer, and the 90% of America, everybody not in the top 10%, 90%, upper middle class, working class, the working poor, the poor, they got 70% of all the growth in income. African Americans locked solidly at the bottom. But starting in the 1960s, 1970s, the black-white wealth gap began to shrink. We weren't in the right place, but we were on the right path. It was a path about opportunity. Government measured everything through the lens of, does it help the middle class? GI Bill, does it help the middle class? Highways, do they help the middle class? Does it create jobs here in America? Then we hit 1980. Ronald Reagan, trickle-down economics, deregulate, let the banks run wild. and taxation, cut taxes for those at the top, and shrink up the investment that we make in education, in infrastructure, in basic research. 1980 to 2016, GDP keeps going up just like it did before. Only the difference is what happens to the 90%. So everybody outside the 10%, how much do they get of that new income growth? The answer, none. Zero. Zip. Nearly 100% of the growth in new income goes to the top 10%. And the black-white wealth gap triples in this period of time. America's middle class has taken one punch after another. And now Donald Trump is poised to deliver the knockout blow. And so I wrote this book partly to tell the story, partly to tell why it happened, how it happened, but partly to say this is how we get back in the fight, because we have to be in this fight. This fight is our fight. It's a fight for what kind of country we are.
Tell me about the relationship between that arc of history that you just described in electoral politics, though, because the Ronald Reagan legacy, we look back at it now, not just as an artificially burnished legacy created by people like the Reagan Legacy Project and all that. We also look back at him being phenomenally electorally successful, both in '80 and in '84. You look at Donald Trump right now, and you look at the stratification of the vote for him. No, he didn't win the popular vote overall, but you look particularly at working poor white vote, and people who probably have the most to lose from him very strongly voted in his direction. How do you explain the difference between those types of outcomes you're describing, how people, I think, can usually intelligently perceive their own self-interest, and the way people vote?
Look, I talk about this in the book. Part of it is an ugly stew of racism. Part of it is Donald Trump tapped into anger. He got that people are deeply angry. They are angry that their kids can't graduate from school without getting crushed by student loan debt. Angry that there aren't good jobs being created right here. Angry that after a lifetime of working hard, you can't retire with a little dignity and security. And people are right to be angry. But Donald Trump said, it's their fault. Those other people, those people who don't worship like you, those people who don't look like you, those people who aren't the same color as you. That was a big part. He told a story. It's just the wrong story. Donald Trump promised. He said, you elect me, and I'm going to get out there, and I'm going to work for you. And look at what he's done. He turned around. You quoted the part in the book about the team he assembled. But now look at what he's done. He's been in place less than 100 days. And go through part of the list. He has already signed off on a law to make it easier for employers to steal their employees' wages. He's made it easier for companies that kill and maim their employees to hide that information. He's made it easier for investment advisors to cheat retirees. And for me, I got to tell you, the Trump Care was like the whole package wrapped up in one. So he embraced this idea that the way we're going to move this country forward, the way we're going to reform health care, is we're going to knock 24 million people out of health care coverage. We're going to raise the cost of health insurance for a whole lot of middle-class families. And why? So they could deliver a tax cut for a handful of millionaires and billionaires. This isn't about what Donald Trump says. This is about what Donald Trump does, and he's delivering one hit after another on working families.
Our guest is Senator Elizabeth Warren. Her new book is This Fight Is Our Fight. I have chained her to the desk. She'll be back in just a moment, despite her wishes. We're back with Senator Elizabeth Warren, who has a new book out called This Fight Is Our Fight. Senator, I opened the top of the show tonight with the discussion about some of the latest revelations around the Trump-Russia issue, which is not the only issue in the world when it comes to the Trump administration, but it's a different kind of issue.
It is.
And I wonder, as you think about the opposition to the Trump agenda, as you think about your role in the Democratic Party, how do you weigh that very different kind of story, that very different kind of scandal and question against the more sort of typical Republican rich guy politics stuff that you rail about in your book, but also so effectively in general?
So look, what the book is about, what I think a big debate in Washington is about, is who government is going to work for. Is it just going to work for the rich guys at the top, or is it actually going to work for the rest of America? And I think that's a huge debate. It's a critical one we've got to have. The Republicans have made it clear. They've thrown in with the rich guys. And let's face it, there's some Democrats who threw in with them too. But the Russia thing, I put in a totally different category, and I try to make a very different argument about it. And that is, that's the one that should not be partisan. I don't care if you're a Democrat, if you're a Republican, if you're an independent, if you're a libertarian. I don't care. You should care whether or not Russia finagled our election or otherwise is calling any of the shots in Washington. Everybody should care. So let's start with what we know absolutely for sure. We know that the intelligence community of the United States of America said Russia hacked in to American systems in order to influence the outcome of the 2016 election. Pow! We know for sure that the FBI has an active and ongoing investigation about the ties between Russia, the Trump campaign, and Donald Trump. Wow. And we know for sure that top Trump aides, as you have just talked about, have been fired because of their ties, their undisclosed ties and connections with Russia. Now, for me, that is enough to say we got to have an investigation. We need a special prosecutor with strong subpoena powers, and we need an independent commission. And all of us should want that. This is not about partisanship. This is about patriotism. We make sure that our leaders and our elections are worried about nothing but the American people. That's our job. And so I think we put that one in a separate category, but I got to tell you, we got to turn the heat up under that. We've got to make sure that we get that special prosecutor and that we get to the bottom of this. Holding hearings behind closed doors, I think that has already been demonstrated not to be very effective, right? When we've got, you know, folks leaking out information. We need it out in public. Special prosecutor, completely independent, special commission. And that's what I'm going to push for. That's what I think a lot of folks are starting to push for. And the question really is, back to anyone else, back to the Republicans in the House and the Senate, why wouldn't you want that? If you're confident your guy is innocent, great. Make it independent. Make it nonpartisan, not bipartisan, nonpartisan. Get a special prosecutor out there, get to the bottom of it, and everyone in America will know what the answer is.
One of the things you write about in the book, in personal terms, is your reaction, your feelings about seeing the big protest movements that have emerged since the election.
Yes.
Do you feel like, on that Russia issue, on the issue of needing a special prosecutor, or an independent investigation, as you say, on some of the other policy issues that you've talked about just here tonight, do you feel like the sort of people power that we have seen in the streets, the new civic engagement for people in the center and the left, people opposed to this president, do you feel like that is the most effective lever for getting those things moved?
Oh, absolutely. And
more so than you and your colleagues in the Senate advocating for them?
Look, more is more. Are you kidding? I'll be out there. I'll shout at the top of my lungs on this. And I will encourage every one of my colleagues to do it. And my colleagues are getting stronger on all of these issues. But the key, I talk about this in the book as we get to the end. I talk about going to the inauguration, seeing Donald Trump, my own eyes. I actually wanted to see it. I wanted to think about it every single moment when I wake up. I mean, every day when I wake up. But the next day, going to the Women's March at Boston Common. And so I'm thinking, because I'm completely into this on this Saturday morning. It's cold out in Boston. And I'm thinking, how are we going to fight back against Trump? And at this point, I know we got to have an army. We got to have an army because it's the only way we can do this. We don't have the votes in the House. We don't have the votes in the Senate. We got to have an army. And I'm thinking, how do you raise an army? Where does an army come from? What does an army look like in a case like this? And so as we're rounding the corner to go into Boston Common, I look up and I'm seeing all these people moving toward the common, the women in pink pussy hats and men pushing strollers and kids on bicycles. And I look over and there's this man with this little girl on his shoulders, and she's holding up this sign. And the sign, hand lettered, carefully done, says, "I fight like a girl." And I thought, me too, sweetie. And that for me was the moment. I said, this is our army. And it did change from that moment, Rachel. You know, keep in mind, we have to remember, the House of Representatives voted 60 plus times to repeal Obamacare, right? You remember this.
They were rehearsing.
They were rehearsing, right? They just over and over and over. And the Senate is like, yeah, let's do this. Donald Trump said how many times during the campaign, on day one, you know, I will get rid of Obamacare. We will repeal it on day one. So Donald Trump wins the election, and people start talking about Obamacare. And they start talking about health care in America. And people start pushing back. And we had one narrative. The one line was, you cannot repeal and run. You have to repeal and replace. And a lot of people in America said, yeah, that sounds right to me. You got to replace it. And then we know what happened next, right? On replace it, all of a sudden, the Republicans have to put out this really ugly plan. And when they do, folks realize how they will be touched, how their neighbors will be touched. It's more even than the personal. It's a sense of the collective. It's even if your health insurance is going to be secure. It's the notion, wait a minute, we are the richest country on earth. Healthcare should be a basic human right. And the more people that attended protests and went to office hours and made phone calls. I'm telling you, those phone calls freaked people out in the United States Senate. In terms of senators saying, holy, what just happened here, right? Those phone calls, those emails, the people who showed up, who made their voices heard. And I want to be clear, they weren't all Democrats. There were a lot of independents in there. There were a lot of Republicans in there. There were a lot of Trump voters in there who said, whoa, whoa, whoa. Wait a minute. That's not what we had in mind for health care reform. We got to do this differently. And then it becomes crucial because by the time they get ready to vote, I get it. There were Republicans who said, this bill that you've put forward is not brutal enough. It does not cause enough pain. Those guys are like over the edge. But the rest of the Republicans wouldn't go there with them. And that's how this thing broke apart. Why would the rest of the Republicans not go there with them? Because of the voices heard across this country. Democracy has changed in this country over the past few months. Democracy has changed, and it's democracy when we get engaged, when we get out there, when we get in this fight, which is what I talk about here. When we do that, we will make our voices heard, and we will return this government to one that works for the people.
Senator Elizabeth Warren is our guest. I have one last question for you. Will you stay there and wait for it?
I will.
Thank you very much. All right, we'll be back with Senator Elizabeth Warren right after this. We're back with Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, who has a new book out called This Fight Is Our Fight. Senator, if you were running for president in 2020, you would not want to talk about it now with me or anybody else. Is that true?
That is true. But let me be clear. I am not running for president in 2020. But what I am doing is I am running for the United States Senate in 2018 from Massachusetts.
I've heard of it.
You've heard of it. But can I make another point on this? Because I think it's actually really important. We were talking just before the break about democracy changing. We can't make democracy a once every 4-year horse race. That we pay a whole lot of attention, who's going to run for president, and we spend all our time, the horses are getting ready and they're getting into this, We can't do that. Democracy has truly changed. It can't be a spectator sport. It can't be a 4-year off.
Well, you're talking about democracy as being about policy, not just about candidates. You're talking about moving people who are in office now, regardless of when they're running.
That's what we've got to do. And that means Donald Trump poses a danger, not just in 4 years. He's still in his first 100 days. I'm worried about what Donald Trump is going to do this evening. I'm worried about what he's going to do when he wakes up at 3 in the morning and hits Twitter. I am worried about what he will do tomorrow and the next day and the next day. And I got to tell you, we got to be strong. We got to be focused. We've got to be in this fight, not later on, but right now.
What do you think the Democratic Party needs to do differently between now and the midterms to avoid what has typically been Democratic underperformance in the midterms? Obviously, the Democrats think they'll pick up some seats because the Republicans hold the White House, and that's sort of the trend there. But Democrats don't do as well in midterm years as they do in presidential
Not usually.
years. What should they do differently this year in order to fix that?
So look, the short version, the first one is we got to be in the fight. We cannot lay down and die. We got to show we're willing to fight, even when we lose. You lose, you get back up and you fight again, and you fight again, and you fight again. Yeah, we lost on Betsy DeVos. She's in there, but by golly, we made the fight. And there are a lot of people who are paying attention to what's going on because being in the fight changes things. It energizes things. It keeps people connected to each other. Second one, we cannot shoot at everything that moves. We just can't. We just have to let some of Donald Trump's craziness go because this is no longer about what he says. This is no longer about how crazy his hair looks or whatever. It's really about the things he is doing, because the things he is doing to take the legs out from underneath America's middle class, to line his own pockets instead of working for the American people, those are the things for which he will be held responsible. And the third thing we got to do is we got to talk about our values. We got to talk about what we get up in the morning for and why we fight all day long. A big part of what I try to do in this book is I tell a lot of stories. Stories about people who worked hard, who played by the rules. Gina, who did it all, who gets a college diploma. It all looks like it works. She's 50 years old now. She works at Walmart. Her husband is a roofer. His knees are starting to go. They have 2 grown sons that they couldn't afford to send to college. And where does she stand right now? When I ask her, are you still middle class? She says, there is no middle class. Because if there was a middle class, I wouldn't have to go to a food pantry. It's what's happening in America. It's the people who give voice to this. Our only chance is not to rely on just the Democrats in the House or the Democrats in the Senate. Our chance is to throw in with each other. And this is our test. What kind of a people are we, and what kind of a country are we going to build? It's up to us.
Senator Elizabeth Warren, Democrat of Massachusetts. New book is called This Fight Is Our Fight. The